Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Jett Whitehead. Jett began his rare book business in January of 1991, following several years of stock acquisition with a strict focus on modern poetry and first edition collection condition. He operates his business from Bay City, Michigan, issuing 6 printed catalogs annually and exhibiting in major book fairs around the country. He was invited to become a member of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America several years ago and is now serving an elected term on the Board of Governors of that association. His stock includes first edition books, chap books, broadsides, manuscript material, and letters written by modern poets. He has also provided appraisal services for several major collections and author archives, and has published articles about modern poetry and the rare book profession. Jett, please come join.
Thank you, Janet, for that lovely introduction. You may start writing all of my press releases. You can start tomorrow. Thank you. And thank you to all of you who have shown my wife Shelley and me such a welcome to Anderson and to the beautiful campus of Anderson University. It's great to be here. It's a privilege. And I also very much want to thank Elizabeth, and she's not here, so Chris and Stephen, if you'll be the torchbearer for me and carry back your mom and I have been talking about this day for a long time, that finally we'll meet face to face. So my wife thinks it's an omen. We need to make a trip down to Florida, so maybe we'll do that. But what I'd like to share with you today, it's been such a wonderful opportunity for us all to be seeing this children's book collection and learning about children's literature. And Mrs. York, of course, did such a beautiful job over the years putting together a beautiful collection of children's literature. But she didn't stop with children's literature. And I like to think of it as a branch from one of those trees that were drawn for us this morning by David. When she branched out, one of the branches was to collect Robert Frost material. And without Elizabeth here to tell the quick story, I'll try to make it as short as possible. But she and I had never met. I'm a book dealer up in Michigan, and she's a resident of southern Florida. But as she explained the story to me, or told the story, not too many years ago, but once she decided, I'm going to do something really seriously about this Robert Frost business, she went to a book fair in St. Petersburg and approached a bookseller and asked, after she looked around, and I'm sure she was looking for some children's literature at the time too, but she asked, well, is there some Robert Frost material possibly? And after a little exchange of dialogue, so the story came to me is that she was directed that, well, if you're really serious about wanting to find some good poetry and some Robert Frost material, there's a fellow up in Michigan named Whitehead. You ought to contact him. Well, Elizabeth shared with me the story, and she said after the 4th booth, and I heard the same story, I decided he's my go-to man. And we have been, although never face-to-face, that has grown into a wonderful relationship, and we've become very good friends because of that. Elizabeth did ask that I incorporate a little of my talk into telling you a little bit about what brought me to poetry. And as Janet indicated, my specialty is poetry, but the exclusive product that I sell is modern poetry, modern being starting with the 20th century. As a kid with children's books in my room also, my parents, and I don't think they were prompting me for this career, but there were some family books in our family that had, my name being Jett, you may think it's a nickname. I'm a third generation, it's a family name. And some of the books that were inherited or that passed through the family, and they had this Jett book plate inside, were placed in my room as I grew up. And on the spines, so many of them were volumes of poetry. So even though those books weren't necessarily books that I was pulling out and reading on a daily basis, they were really adult books. But I think there was this little subliminal, we hear from the advertising industry that you go to the movie and it says Coca-Cola every few seconds and it makes you thirsty. Well, I think that was driving me to poetry. And by the time I was in high school, I had my first poem published, and that, of course, told me that I would become famous and have great numbers of volumes of books published, but that hasn't happened yet. But it's kept it's kept me focused and visioned that I wanted to dedicate really my efforts in my life as an avocation and as a vocation to poetry. So after my undergraduate years and Dad paying my tuition, thank you, Dad, I was a major in business, but I was taking a lot of creative writing classes and poetry classes through the English department at Northern Michigan University in Marquette. And then after graduating from Northern and traveling in Europe and meeting the woman who would become my wife, Shelley, we went to graduate school at Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, where I did my master's work in poetry and creative writing. Hopefully, and I think this is the right thing to say when we're on a college campus, hopefully people take their classroom work seriously and they learn from their professors as much as they can. Perhaps the greatest thing that I learned in college is what I learned outside of the classroom, but from one of my professors who mentored me into becoming a book collector. The class that I had, this gentleman's name, who unfortunately passed away several years ago, but John Hepler. And it was a graduate level seminar. There were no more than a dozen students in the class. And so the syllabus said we were going to be studying Robert Frost, Emily Dickinson, and Stevens. And by a show of hands, I think, on the first day of class, well, who should we study first? I raised my hand very high and said, let's do Robert Frost. And a few of my companions in class followed suit, and so we started studying Robert Frost, not only his work, but learning about him as an individual. Well, this was a class that was a semester, not just a trimester or a short term. It was a full semester. When we were second to the last week of the semester and we were still kicking Robert Frost around the block, Dr. Hepler said, we really do need to move on to Emily Dickinson. So we did. And but on the last day of class, this was announced a week or two before the last day, we were going to meet in Dr. Hepler's home rather than meeting in the classroom. And he said that Mrs. Hepler wanted to host a tea in their home. And so I was very much looking forward to that afternoon. And though their home wasn't a huge mansion, it was a good-sized house with lots of rooms, and artifacts from where they had lived throughout their lifetime were in every room. So they just gave us full range and just, roam around, have fun, look around. They had lived in Africa, the Canary Islands, Spain, and so there's, paintings and sculptures and just wonderful artifacts all throughout the house. I didn't realize, but where I stumbled into was Dr. Hepler's study. And I've seen the photograph in Signature magazine of Elizabeth standing before her bookcases. Well, Dr. Hepler's weren't quite as grand as Elizabeth's, but in his study, it was 4 walls, floor to ceiling, built-in bookcases, loaded with the most incredible things that I'd ever seen. I couldn't get out of the room. Finally, Dr. Hepler came in and said, he liked to call me Lad. He said, Lad, what are you doing in here? Everybody else is out roaming through the house. And I said, I can't leave this room. It's just marvelous. And he got it, I was saying the right words. He, smiled and said, well, this is the end of the semester, but maybe we should get together next week and have coffee or get together for lunch, and we'll talk about the books that are in this room and what makes them special. So indeed, we did get together about a week later, and I learned that some of the books I was looking at were Shakespeare folios. They were first edition books of Emerson, of Hawthorne, and the brass door knocker that was mounted to a piece of wood that hung in the room was actually the brass door knocker off of Emerson's home in Massachusetts. And the subsequent meetings that we had then through the course of that summer, he mentored me not only into becoming a book collector, but also the discovery that there is available in books, and not just the printed text, which is very important, but learning about how the books come about and where they've traveled. And he truly opened my eyes to what would become then my career. So let's look at some Robert Frost books. The collection that Mrs. York put together had a few common denominators that were a pleasure to work with, and one is that they have to be first editions. If there's not a first edition, then what makes it so special that we would want to collect it? Condition was very, very important, and signed books and scribed books were, of course, ideal. So it was very fun to put that together. But let's start with his first book, which is sort of impossible, and I don't want somebody to call me on this if they've really been doing their homework. Robert Frost's first book was titled Twilight. It was a self-published book, though printed. Frost was very young at the time, was dating a woman named Eleanor, and he wanted to impress her. And he wasn't, a football player, and he couldn't do this and couldn't do that, but he thought he could write poems. So he went to a printer and took a few poems of his poems, and he paid the printer to print 2 copies of a book. It was just, a few pages in it, called Twilight. And he was so anxious when the printer finished the job, and he looked through the book, and he was very proud of it, and 1 copy was for himself. And the second copy was to go to Eleanor. So they had to date. And they went out on the date, and he was waiting for the right time, almost like he was going to ask her to marry him or something. And the right time came up, and he pops out his prize. And she was nonplussed. He was so heartbroken, he went home that night and tore up and destroyed his copy. Well, there's a happy ending. Boy wins girl. They did get married. Maybe so he could get the other copy back. And that copy was preserved and saved by a Frost collector, not unlike Mrs. York, and he donated it to the University of Virginia, along with a large collection. So his name is Barrett, Clifton Waller Barrett. So if you want to see the true first book that Frost published, you'd have to go down there. But his first trade book is called A Boy's Will, and we have an example of it here, and we'll walk around and show it to you. A Boy's Will, and you can see it, not a very large, thick book, was published when Frost couldn't find an audience in the United States. People just, he was a modern poet. You may read him now and think, well, what's so modern about this? At the time, he was his work wasn't abstract, but he was thought of like modern painters at the early part of the 20th century. People weren't getting it because he was playing by different rules as he was writing. A lot of the verse didn't rhyme, although there's strong meter to it. So he moved his family to England and it was in England that this first book was published while he was there by a firm by the name of David Nutt. And he had heard that David Nutt, even though they weren't a big firm, that they were taking a chance and publishing some unknown people that were doing different things in literature. Well, he was crestfallen when he presented himself in person at the publisher to find out that David had died. But Mrs. Nutt was going to do what she could to keep the business going. She liked the manuscript, accepted it. The business was not well funded. She spent what money she could to have 1,000 copies of the pages printed. Well, that's not going to do you any good unless you can bind it. She was practically broke, but she spent what she could, or scraped up what she could, and she had about 300, it's the exact number people like to argue about, but around 300, 350 copies of the very first binding, which is hardbound. It's not what I'm holding in my hand. It's hardbound. They refer to it as the bronze pebbled cloth. But the rest of those sheets over the years did get saved and rebound, and they were essentially bound in a total of 4 different bindings, and this is one of the later bindings, but it's still considered a copy of the first edition because it is the first edition of the printed sheets. So the book in itself, and you can imagine a paperback, I mean, we all have them. I've got an Agatha Christie by the side of my bed at home, and it's so dog-eared and worn out looking. As this is passed around, take note, pristine condition, absolutely amazing. Somebody scribbled in it, though. The title page, there's some scribbling in a recognizable handwriting, at least recognizable to me, that says, "First printing of my first book, Robert Frost." And this is from 1913. So, and I will ask that we play by a slightly different set of rules, and that even though we learned this morning from David that Mrs. York likes her books handled and read, I would rather you not handle, at least after lunch in my presence, the books that I'm sending around. When we go back home, you can change the rule again. The second book that was published is called North of Boston. And Frost and his family were still living in London at the time that second book was published. So it too was published by the firm of Nutt. And taking a real struggle because Mrs. Nutt still hadn't come up with the money to do any more bindings than that first 300 and some odd copies of the first book, but she went ahead and said, "Sure, we'll do your next book." It was getting very nice reviews, and she thought, okay, second time might be the charm. And when they published North of Boston, they did send some copies back to America, which they hadn't done on the first book, and it got into some hands of reviewers. And although Frost didn't realize it until he got back to America, the reviewers were loving it. But, you know, we didn't have the internet and all of this business. And so when Frost was he was sort of tired of living in England, and he wanted to get back to the country, or to the United States, and he had 2 books published already, and he thought, well, heck, why not? So they pack up and they move back, and they are greeted almost as though he's a star. He couldn't believe it when he got off the ship. And one thing that happened, one of those review copies got into the hands of Mrs. Henry Holt, who was the wife of, even back then, the name of Henry Holt and Company was a very large publisher. Not as big as it eventually became, but it was a large publisher. And Henry hadn't paid any attention to it whatsoever, but Mrs. Holt, who was not on the staff at all, but she got a hold of it, she read it, and I think there must have been some pillow talk. She said, if you know what's good for your business, you're going to sign this guy up. And Henry followed his wife's suggestion, and they had a beautiful arrangement then, and Holt remained his principal publisher until Frost died, which was just a few months after Kennedy was inaugurated, and many of us, I'm sure, saw that inauguration ceremony when Frost read a poem. But the third book, then, is really the first book that was published in the United States as a trade book, and that is Mountain Interval. And it was with this book that Frost books really started looking like a book, like you'd recognize at Barnes & Noble. What makes this copy incredibly terrific is the condition. When you take the dust jacket off, it looks like a brand new book. I mean, the gold just shines. The dust jacket itself was printed on paper that rarely survived. High acid content. There are very few examples of even shreds of this dust jacket anywhere. And the copy that is in your collection is perfect, absolutely perfect. So not wanting you to judge a book, Gesundheit, by the cover, but take note of this one.
Is it nicer than the one in Virginia?
Yes. Frost, we have, well, I don't like to stereotype, but I know a lot of people have this image of Frost, and he's this grandfatherly figure from New England, and probably likes to bounce kids on his knee, and he's this folksy guy. Well, Frost really did like to promote that image, but it really wasn't his image. And those of you who may have done some research or reading of Robert Frost as a person over the years, he was pretty hard bolts, nuts and bolts kind of guy. And he wasn't born in New England. He was born on the left side. He was born in California. But early in his life, his family moved to the east side, to the East Coast. And so he moved there and felt very, and when you read about his early writings, that he really felt like he was at home when he got to New England. So that part was very real. But when he was getting his books published and he was meeting with Henry Holt, and he didn't have tremendous objection to the book that's going around right now, Mountain Interval, but he liked aesthetics, and he wanted his books to look just right. And though he liked the look of that book, when you look at the poems on the page, the printing is real small, and some of the layouts weren't the way that he envisioned his poetry, how it should look. So he took issue with Mr. Holt, said, "We're not going to use your jobber anymore to do my books. I want them to come out looking more like pieces of art." And so Mr. Holt rolled his eyes and said, "Okay." And a New York City publisher, so he started looking around in New York City, lots of resources available, and he found a young printer named Joseph Blumenthal, who was running a fine press called the Spiral Press. And he spoke with Mr. Blumenthal and said, "Look, I've got this problem with one of my authors. Could you possibly help me set some type and help design his next book?" And he said, "Sure, be happy to take on that project." Well, fortunately, Frost and Blumenthal got together to collaborate a little bit, and Frost liked Blumenthal very much, and that became a relationship that lasted throughout Frost's years. And Joe Blumenthal designed most of the books that were printed. He designed Frost's Christmas cards, and he actually even designed a type font that is called Emerson, but he designed it for Frost. So I have a couple of the books that Joe Blumenthal played a part in. One is Steeplebush, and at this point, Frost was so popular that when they would come out with they being Henry Holt, when they would come out with a trade edition of the book, which is what you would typically see at Barnes & Noble, they would also do a limited edition. And the limited editions didn't always precede the trade books, but often they would by a few days, or in some cases a week or two. And they take they're a whole different shape. They're not always bigger, but typically they're bigger. They're published in in what we call a slip case, and this is an example of the original slip case that this book came in. And rather than having a printed dust jacket, they had what is referred to in the trade as a glassine jacket. And this is very fragile, and yet the one in my hand is in perfect condition. And then there is what is referred to as a colophon page that can sometimes tell you a little bit of how the book was made or what type fonts and so forth. And it's, in this case, signed and numbered by Frost. So we have copy number 648, let's see, out of a total edition of 751 copies. So it's interesting to see this. So we'll pass this around. Holt wanted to do something really special to commemorate one of Frost's senior birthdays. So they worked with him they asked him to put together his own little, not anthology, but instead of a collected poems or selected poems, to put together a collection of some of his more favorite poems and then a few new ones. And this is the result of it, and it's aforesaid, and this was done only in a signed limited edition. The only way you can get a hold of a copy of this book is the way you see it today. See it right here. It too came in a slip case with a printed spine. And in this case, this is copy number 16 out of 650 copies, and Frost has inscribed this for Phyllis and Prescott's collection and noted RF. Well, Prescott was one of Frost's relatives, and then signed in full. There was a collaboration made. Random House was a gigantic publisher, and they wanted to do something really blow it out of the water. And they went to Holt for special permission, and Holt said, sure, but Joseph Blumenthal has to design your book. Well, Random House didn't like that. They wanted to do their own work. He said, no deal without Joe Blumenthal designing the book. So here we have an example of a book that Joe Blumenthal designed, but it was published by Random House. Oh, yeah. There's a letter inside, which I'm not going to open up because of it's fragile, but it's from Joseph Blumenthal. All of these things are in your collection. I hope you're drooling over it. There's another special thing about this particular copy. It has inside a book plate that is for Frederick Baldwin Adams, Jr. Well, Mr. Adams was a friend of Frost, and when Kennedy was having trouble convincing Khrushchev that we were nice people, Frost became an ambassador and flew to Russia and met with Khrushchev, and Mr. Adams was his companion. And when they came back, then Adams wrote a book about the story and and loaded with photographs too. And that book is also in your collection. I didn't bring it, but this is Mr. Adams' copy. You starting to get the idea? I'll finish the show and tell with two examples of Christmas cards. But how the Christmas cards started is rather fun, and hopefully we're all still sending Christmas cards. Shelley and I do. A lot of Mr. Frost's poems were obviously, in the hands of Joe Blumenthal at the Spiral Press. And it was the fall of one year, and he and his wife were wondering, what should we do for our Christmas card? And he thought, geez, I've got a couple of his poems that haven't been really assigned to any collection yet. I don't think he'd mind. Let's print up a few copies and we'll send it to our friends. It'll be our Christmas gift to them. Well, he did a nice job printing it and he sent them out. Well, probably our moms and dads told us, don't do sneaky stuff. You'll get caught. Well, Frost found out, and it was almost the end of the Joseph Blumenthal relationship of ever designing any more Frost books. And I had the footnote here. Shelley and I have been blessed and privileged to meet a lot of wonderful people in this journey we've been making, and one of them was a friend of ours from Connecticut, was also a friend of Joe Blumenthal's. And over the years, Shelley and I got to meet Joe, and we'd have drinks with him at his home in Connecticut. And so Joe shared a lot of anecdotes with me. He said, Jett, I was never so terrified in my life. I knew I would be fired from Henry Holt. They would probably blackball me. I would never get another job printing anything ever. And he said, after Frost rode me up one side and down the other, just saying every terrible thing he could to me, he paused and said, and next year when you do this, print some for me to send to my friends. So I have a couple examples of the Frost Christmas cards, and these are highly, highly, highly collectible. This particular one, neither out far nor in deep, from 1935, and it has a little illustration in it. But this one carries Robert Frost's signature on the title page. Frost seldom signed these Christmas cards. It was his poem, his name was printed on it. He seldom signed them. But if you're diligent, you can look around and find copies that he personalized. Almost always, if he personalized it, it was only with his initials RF. And this is an example of one that he signed his whole name on it. The paper that was used, it's not really a dust jacket, but to decorate the book, is highly aesthetic. And every example of this that I've ever seen, you can see where the acid bleeds through and actually starts to burn the free end page. But can we? And the other example of one that we have is an unstamped letter in our rural letterbox. It's one of my favorite, aesthetically speaking. I just love the rust colors. And some more scribbling inside for Dave Stevens from Robert Frost, again spelled out completely. I'll just oh, thank you. Not to close the book on Frost, I don't think we'd ever want to do that, but Frost was very important to the genre of modern poetry, not only with his readership, but his work inspired so many other poets that his stamp, his signature, is on the work of so many modern writers, people who really never met him or studied under him. But and examples would be there's a collection by three Nobel laureates, Derek Walcott. Now let's go to the notes. Joseph Brodsky, the Russian poet Joseph Brodsky, Derek Walcott, and the Irish poet Seamus Heaney. And the three of them together have a book that you can buy today. It's in, I forget what printing it's in now, but it's Homage to Robert Frost. And it's there, all the three of them writing about how important of a poet he was and how his work influenced their work. We have a past poet laureate of the United States, Donald Hall, who is in his 80s and still writing in New Hampshire. And he has said many times how greatly influenced he was as an early, in his early writing and also in his later writing to the work of Frost. So I'll close my remarks in thanking you for your attention and also for giving a safe home to these wonderful Frost books. And if you ever decide you need to, like, pave a parking lot and you want to deaccession them, call me first. Thank you.
Jett, thank you for those wonderfully insightful comments and for sharing these treasures with us. I think we all probably have a better idea now of the scope of what we really have here. This day focuses on children's literature, appropriately so. It's a magnificent children's literature collection. But we thought that it was important and that we would have the opportunity at this luncheon to share the insight that goes far beyond children's literature, that there's the fabulous Frost collection. I know there's an incredible collection of Robert Louis Stevenson. It's truly a remarkable collection in many, many ways. Hasn't this been a great day? Doesn't it make you want to go home and read a book or read a book to your grandchildren? But we've got other good things this afternoon before we do that. We have other sessions coming right on the heels of our time together here at 1:30. Rob Hiddle, our rare book expert, who, by the way, appraised the entire collection. He's familiar with every piece in here. He will be presenting back over in Miller Chapel at the School of Theology, followed at 2:30 by Valeska Gregory, and at 4 o'clock, Linda Vieira will be making her presentation. There will be a time during the time over there for when we will have the opportunity to purchase books from our authors, our guests, and an opportunity to have them signed. So I hope you'll take advantage of the many special things that are still to come on this special day. With that, I think we'll close, and we'll adjourn back over to Miller Chapel. Thank you so much for being with us.